Hi, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and start. Welcome, and thanks for coming to the Oddball panel, where the conversation I think will take a slightly different shape than maybe the conference is accustomed to. But hopefully, we'll find it interesting and ideally productive and generative. And I'm Jeff Insko. I'm on the board. I'll say more about myself in a minute. I'm mainly playing the role of moderator, but I will make some prefatory remarks to kind of explain some of the thinking behind this unusual panel. But before I do that, I want to just introduce the two scholars who will be doing the heavy lifting today. And then again, I'll provide some contextual remarks. So, Kai Bosworth holds a PhD in geography from the University of Minnesota, and he has a BA in environmental studies from Macalester College. His research examines new forms of environmental populism emerging from struggles over oil pipelines in the upper Midwest. You may have heard about some of these, where farmers, ranchers, and native nations have collaborated to delay the Keystone XL pipeline. His research attempts to understand the ways that such groups are attempting to build a mass movement for climate justice while also confronting issues of racism, nationalism, and settler colonialism in North America. He's working on a book on that subject, which has the tentative title of Pipeline Populism, Affective Infrastructures of Grassroots Environmentalism in the 21st Century. And maybe already you can see that this panel speaks a slightly different language than what's going on in that other room. Up next is Stacey Balkan, who is an assistant professor of environmental literature and humanities at Florida Atlantic University, where she also serves as a faculty affiliate for Florida Atlantic's Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Initiative. Dr. Balkan's teaching and research focus on post-colonial ecologies, environmental justice, landscape aesthetics, petrocultures and petromodernity, and global South literatures. Her current, I think that's me dinging for some reason, sorry about that. Her current book projects include a monograph called Rogues in the Post-Colony, Narrating Extraction and Itinerancy in India, which is about the environmental impacts of uneven development on the subcontinent. And she has a forthcoming essay collection called Oil Fictions, World Literature and Our Contemporary Petrosphere. She has a PhD in English with concentrations in post-colonial and eco-critical studies from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. As for me, some of you know already I'm on the board of directors of the Trust, but my involvement in these pipeline matters began 7 years ago when the Enbridge replaced its Line 6B pipeline that spilled in the Kalamazoo River in Marshall, which just happens to traverse my backyard. There's my backyard and my dog, Sam. And that was the backyard before the replacement project, and that's what it looked like some months afterwards. And what we did initially was my wife and I contacted the Pipeline Safety Trust to talk about what to do when a pipeline company comes knocking on your door and wants to cut down all your trees. And they invited me to speak the next year in 2012 here at this conference, and they haven't been able to get rid of me since. However, in my day job, I'm just a professor of literature. And while most of my research, for the first half of my career anyway, third of my career, I'm not sure how far into my career, has really been about 19th century American literature, the politics of slavery and abolition. Lately, my recent research has attempted to kind of merge my scholarly life and my involvement in these pipeline matters. So now I'm writing an environmental history of the Kalamazoo River spill, for example, and for the past few years, I've been teaching courses on things like oil culture and energy and literature, which is the syllabus that I'm showing here, which is the course that I'm currently teaching. And I have this amazing group of students who didn't know energy and literature was a thing, and they're really excited and they're quite brilliant. And I'm partly saying that because I'm going to require them to watch this panel at some later date. No, they're really a great bunch. And so I just wanted to situate this just a little bit as a way of turning things over to Kai and Stacey. So in bringing together literary studies and cultural studies with these other matters, energy and infrastructure, that are ordinarily left to the scientists and the engineers, I've joined a whole bunch of scholars, Kai and Stacey included, who over the past 10 years, or even less really, have begun to examine the many intersections and entanglements between energy and culture. The entanglements, that is, between sources of energy, including infrastructures like pipelines, and all sorts of cultural productions like art and literature and social forms and our desires and our ideas about what the good life is, and even our bodily experiences, which are bound up with energy in all sorts of ways. We enjoy the rush of speeding down the freeway and the comfort of taking a warm shower. Those things are all bound up in fossil fuels. So the reason, though, that so many scholars from the humanistic disciplines, like literature, like history and anthropology and political science, have suddenly become interested in energy and the intersections between energy and culture is not a mystery. It's about climate change. And as the authors that I'm, Dominic Boyer and Emmy Zeman, who I'm showing a heading for their essay on the rise of the Energy Humanities, put it, they say, how can we cope with the rising demand for energy when our current portfolio of energy sources is already inducing global warming, ocean acidification, and climate change? And we could add a whole bunch of other things to that list. Mass migrations and displacements and species extinction and the rest. And so tackling that sort of problem that they articulate, energy humanists insist, requires thinkers other than engineers and scientists and politicians. They're an important part of the puzzle too. But also to tackle these problems, we need scholars who have expertise in what, again, I'm quoting Boyer and Zeman, who have expertise in, quote, imagining the future relationship between energy and society that we need to strive toward. And that's the sort of idea here of energy transition, that for many of us it seems inevitable that we are in a moment of energy transition, and there are complicated ways that we need to think about that. So we need people who have studied past energy transitions. It's important to remind ourselves, despite how inevitable fossil fuel lifestyles seem, that it's really sort of a blip in human history and an even smaller blip in geological or planetary history. So this is not the first time we've gone through an energy transition. And so we might learn from people who have studied past energy transitions, just as we might learn from people who engage in various forms of imaginative speculation, like science fiction writers, for example, and artists. In other words, the claim on the part of energy humanists is that climate change, energy transition, isn't just a technical problem, it's a kind of imaginative problem. And that requires other modes of thinking. And just to give you a sense of how many different kinds of scholars are working in the energy humanities now, here's just a bunch of books, some by political scientists, some by historians, some by literary scholars. Here's a bunch more. And again, like almost all of these books, this is like an explosion of interest on the part of scholars in disciplines like literary studies and history and anthropology and elsewhere. All these books have been published in the last 10 years, many of them in the past 5 or 6 years. So there's a kind of explosion of interest in these matters. So I've wanted to bring these kinds of conversations that are happening among scholars to conversations about pipeline safety at the Pipeline Safety Trust Conference. And we tried an experiment like this a couple of years ago when I brought an anthropologist and a historian and a literary scholar to talk a bit about petrocultures as a sort of field of inquiry, and people seemed intrigued and interested, and so my colleagues were kind enough to let me try it again. And so Kai and Stacey are going to talk about these things a bit, even if that means sort of shifting the vocabulary and shifting the conversation somewhat. And so I just want to say then one last thing by way of kind of illustrating an additional feature of this moment of what I'm calling energy transition. And that's just a story about my teaching this semester. So I'm teaching the energy and literature class, but I'm also just teaching like the 19th century literary survey class. And I have a student in the latter class, her name's Emma, and she's a really fantastic student. And she's super smart, and she is an engineering major, but she's an English minor. And we had a conversation about this just last week, and she said, well, you know, my heart is with English and literary studies, but I want to get a job. My parents want me to get a job. And even though, like, she's misguided on that point, English majors do quite well. I won't bore you with those statistics, but it's true. You know, she's straddling these two kinds of worlds, and we wound up having this really interesting conversation. I told her about the Pipeline Safety Trust and my work, and that I'm coming here to this conference, and she was suddenly quite animated, and she said, you know, I'm really interested in like an engineering career that might take place in the kind of energy sector or the energy environmental sector, and we had this sort of, and then she expressed to me some of her concerns and reservations about working in the energy sector because she feels deeply the urgency and the anxiety that so many young people feel about climate change. And so, you know, she articulated what I think is a sort of a dilemma for the industry at this moment, and that is, what do you do when people who might otherwise seek careers in your industry feel like that industry does not share their values? And that's where this student is coming from. And I think it's one of the elements of this moment of energy transition, and one of the reasons why conversations about things like desires and experiences and values need to be an important part of the conversation, so that maybe one day, like, you know, Emma can come and work for your company and make the pipelines that we have safer until we transition to a moment when we don't need any more pipelines. So I'll stop there, and I will turn it over to Kai, and followed by Stacey. So thank you. Thanks, Kai.
Yep. All right, so let me get my timer going here. Thanks, Jeff, for that really good introduction, and thanks to you all for making the long, arduous trek over here to this room from the room that had the coffee closer to it. When we talk about energy, sometimes the humanists like to make jokes about different kinds of fuel, and I know that I've been appropriately fueled up today by multiple cups of coffee. So hopefully I don't talk too fast or jump around a little bit too much. So like Jeff said, I'm a geographer, but I teach in the School of World Studies in a Department of International Studies. And my background is actually also in environmental studies. So I'm at really a confluence of a bunch of different new and kind of interdisciplinary fields. And so I'm really excited to be talking here today about the research I've been doing over the past almost 10 years now with pipeline opponents in the upper Midwest, primarily in South Dakota. So my talk today is called All Pipelines Leak, which is kind of a slogan that you'll hear opponents use, and I want to unpack it and really think about how we can interpret this as not a technical problem that they're pointing to, but a social or political problem, as Jeff sort of just said. So a quick roadmap here. I'm going to talk a little bit and introduce you all to what it means for geographers to study energy, and what three kind of principal arenas of questions that energy geographers are asking right now. And then I'm going to talk about my own work and use those kind of three modes or sets of questions to look at the Keystone XL and Dakota Access Pipeline in the upper Midwest. And then by way of concluding, as long as I don't talk either too fast or too slow, I'll talk a little bit about this question of social versus technical problem, or political versus technical problem. And so energy geographies, if you think about, if I asked you what a geographer does, some of you might say make maps, maybe GI science, or you might think of the physical landscape itself. But really, geography is a very weird interdisciplinary mode of thought, a mode of inquiry, that also includes a lot of social scientists and humanists. Not ones who are good at making diagrams, it seems, but if you were to diagram it in a confusing way, it would look something like this. So I'm in this sort of region here as a human geographer. And what human geographers do is really ask questions about why people and things are where they are, and how we can understand the patterns and distributions that we can see there. So 3 problems of energy geographies that human geographers think about. So first of all is really the problem of uneven spatial distribution. When we look at energy infrastructure or different kinds of energy regimes, we ask how are economic, environmental, or social benefits distributed unevenly? We can think about that word unevenly both in terms of space, rural versus urban, or certain parts of regions of a country versus others. But we can also think about it in terms of social position and the ways in which benefits or risks accrue to people based on where they are in relationship to a given energy infrastructure system. Are they workers? Are they residents, citizens, part of an oil firm, so on and so forth. And specifically when we think about energy systems, then we're also interested in comparing and contrasting different kinds of regimes. So certainly looking at fossil fuel versus renewables, nuclear versus coal, or even within this last kind of session, talking about the difference between conventional and unconventional distribution systems. So Keystone XL versus DAPL is a very, very interesting question for us. But the problem of uneven spatial distribution, a kind of classic form that energy geographers and others have looked at it, is really oftentimes based on the question of environmental injustice and environmental racism. And this kind of highlights the way that uneven spatial distribution is not only about the physical manifestation of risk or benefit, but also how those are perceived, right? So if certain communities feel that they are being unfairly burdened or targeted, such as indigenous folks, or here in Virginia, where I now teach, the community of Union Hill, which has really accused the ACP pipeline routing of unfairly burdening them with possible risk, then that can ultimately lead to resistance and yeah. So the second kind of problem, Jeff kind of already alluded to it, energy cultures. So uneven spatial distribution, okay, that's not too far out there, but now we're getting into the kind of heady, weird stuff. So here we're really interested in how fossil fuels or really any energy system might influence how we experience nature, space, place, or even our sense of self, how we understand community, so on and so forth. And this is really where I'm kind of located, and especially thinking about how energy infrastructures generate emotions. Of course, art and media are part of that, and as is literature. But really, I'm interested in what our reactions to, or what various people's reactions to energy infrastructure tells us about ourselves or about our country or region. Specifically, I'm interested in rural communities. So what does it tell us about how rural American identities are sort of felt or experienced at this certain political moment? And we can also look at an example closer to where we are right now. At the Audubon Aquarium of the Americas here in New Orleans, just a couple blocks down, we have this exhibition of a reef rig where the sort of aquarium and the display describe how offshore facilities create habitat for species in the Gulf Coast. Now this is presented, in a kind of like classically scientific and naturalist sort of way. And so you might say, hey, is that really energy culture? But in fact, of course, we could tell all different kinds of stories about how oil and gas development have impacted, benefited, as well as caused different kinds of risks for communities as well as different species here in the Gulf region. And so, an energy culture framework might look at museum experience or aquarium experience and ask, hey, what are people actually taking from this exhibition? How does it change who they are? How does it change how they think about Louisiana culture, right? Okay, and then the problem 3, really energy transitions and energy futures. So really, a lot of us are really thinking through, and there's really intense debates about what kinds of events precipitate energy transitions, not only in the future, but also in the past. So oftentimes our kind of gut reaction might be that innovation, technical innovation, really precipitates change from one form of energy to another. But many historians and social scientists are more amenable to arguments that tease out the ways in which economic, political, and cultural factors all lead into creating any kind of energy transition. Energy transitions are already happening. We're in the midst of one right now, primarily from coal to natural gas, and there will be energy transitions in the very near future. And when we look at these energy transitions, then we want to ask who benefits, who loses, who makes the decisions, and how do we know any of these factors. We can also look towards the past. This is my favorite kind of representation of who benefits from a past energy transition. So this is an 1860s cartoon, the grand ball given by the whales in honor of the discovery of oil wells in Pennsylvania. So the whales are celebrating their clear beneficiaries of an energy transition away from blubber towards fossil fuel. But this example is actually very complicated, and historians, and especially economic historians, have a raging kind of debate about why and under what conditions this transition was precipitated. Not simply because of discovery or of a technical innovation, but also because of changing economic relations in the whole global system, right? All right, so let's look at these three kinds of questions in a concrete example: pipeline opposition in the upper Midwest. So for the past, like I said, since around 2010, 2011, I've been working with and studying pipeline opposition, primarily in South Dakota, but also in North Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, a little bit in Minnesota, and trying to understand the various different kinds of groups that have formed in opposition, what's the basis of their opposition, and what does that tell us about this region, right? So Jeff already mentioned I'm working on a book right now, and a very kind of chunky title that's directed towards a particular academic audience, of course, but just to unpack what this means, really I'm interested in this question of how, when we look at the history of American environmentalism, pipeline fights indicate a change away from this kind of big, elitist, nonprofit sort of model of environmental activism led by large federal groups towards a more kind of grassroots, everyday citizen kind of intervention, folks who might not even call themselves, especially in South Dakota, might not even call themselves environmentalists, right? And so that's kind of what I'm indicating by the word populist now, which is very contentious and is a whole other bag of worms that we can talk about. So I worked with and followed a number of different kinds of organizations. So what do I do as a social scientist? I do interviews, I do participant observation and ethnography, which is just a fancy word for hanging out with people, going to concerts, cookouts, protests, public hearings, a lot of the kind of official events, and experiencing them from the side of the public, from the side of a non-expert, and try to understand what their sort of take on all this kind of stuff is. So let's work through these three problems. So of course, uneven spatial distribution. You saw the map in the last slide, and if you know anything about the kind of main pipeline distribution systems in North America, this region of western South Dakota really doesn't have anything passing through it. And so folks there and this kind of sparsely populated but fiercely independent kind of population of ranchers, small landowners, native nations, really felt that this pipeline was unfairly targeting them, and this had to do also with a kind of history of experiencing energy extraction in the region and being kind of a throwaway part of the country in some kind of senses. But we also have to pay attention to the kind of rooting and this question of perception of uneven impacts on a certain population. So of course, Keystone XL, going through the NEPA process, had to do an environmental justice analysis, and both Keystone XL and Dakota Access really tried, I think, pretty consciously in their rooting process, to avoid the administrative boundaries of South Dakota's Native American reservations, which you see here in brown. But perhaps unbeknownst to them, without a kind of longer and deeper analysis, these kinds of administrative boundaries are not really recognized by many of the native groups in this part of the state. The 1851 and 1868 treaties of Fort Laramie really granted this entire portion of the land to the Aecheti Shakota Oyate, or the Lakota, Dakota, and Dakota people. And even the United States Supreme Court has recognized that these treaties were broken by the United States federal government. And so the pipelines themselves were seen as infractions on indigenous sovereignty in a way that if you don't understand the relationship, or if you come into this situation without a broader understanding of the relationship and history of indigenous kind of politics in this region, you might not have anticipated. And so the existence of the pipelines created a whole lot of emotions, of anger, resentment, fear, and I certainly do a lot studying those kinds of negative reactions, but pipeline opposition is also about creating a certain kind of cohesion, new forms of rural identity, certain forms of community and solidarity, and really kind of reconciliation among native and non-native folks who oftentimes would never even have talked to each other were these not there. And so a lot of what I did also involved really, really long, arduous days of field work like this one, attending a Neil Young and Willie Nelson concert on the route of the Keystone XL pipeline in Nebraska, and understanding how these kinds of events bring people together, and what kinds of messages about this region and about the people living there are sort of evidenced here. And I'm not going to get into this too much in this talk, but a big chunk of what I have to say about it is that there's also a lot of disagreement amongst, or contradictions amongst that coalition about what kinds of visions of a future, of the good life, of generational kind of passing down of heritage are shared or not shared amongst pipeline opponents. And so that leads me into this third kind of question of energy transitions, energy futures. And here I really want to highlight that one thing that we can learn from pipeline opponents is that a big chunk of what people feel is tied not so much to fear of pipeline spills or to even something like climate change, but it's all about their experience of democracy and decision making. How do they experience public engagement hearings or forums? Are these meaningful experiences? Do they feel heard or not? And in that way, I think that the politics of pipeline opposition really extend well beyond pipelines themselves to a deeper question that we, I think, probably should ask ourselves about democracy in this country and what it means, what it kind of entails, what sort of responsibilities and duties follow from citizenship, and how we understand the relationship between the public and institutions like public utilities commissions, for example. And so, yeah, I'm doing okay. Just by way of the third part of this talk, then, what do we think about this statement, or how can we understand this statement that all pipelines leak, which you'll see in kind of internet graphics, on signs, so on and so forth, that the only way to get to zero incidents, as we're sort of talking about a possible goal, is to have zero pipelines, right? If we take this as a technical, and of course we know that to a certain degree there are also experiences of this in this region. The Keystone XL spill in North Dakota of earlier last week being only the kind of most recent one. Okay, so is this a technical problem? Is this a problem to be solved by producing yet another environmental impact statement of some 1,400 pages? If all pipelines leak is a technical problem, then what we're going to look for is a technical solution, right? We're going to look for some way of bringing together all of the groups who have interests in producing pipeline safety, following proper procedure or developing a procedure that can help everyone, including stakeholder voices and mitigating risks and unfair burdens wherever possible. And what I want to highlight here is that engineering or technical solutions then become the way of dealing with both the infrastructure systems themselves, as well as the way in which people interface with the decisions made about infrastructure systems. That is things like participation meetings, right? Now, pipeline opponents in the upper Midwest really highlight a number or make a number of different critiques of these. Again, some of which are based on reality, some of which are based on perception. but are important if we do want to think about what kinds of cultures or emotions are generated in these kinds of spaces. So the understanding is that the procedure that already exists is really rigged or set up to avoid what are imagined to be environmentally or socially just outcomes. So people go through these public hearings. I mean, for Keystone XL, again, almost a decade now. Some 82 public hearings have occurred along the length of the pipeline and in other places like DC. There are also Public Utilities Commission hearings, evidentiary hearings, so on and so forth. And going through this process, as some landowners and Native nations and interveners, like groups like Dakota Rural Action, have done for this entire period, has not given them particularly, made them particularly confident about the setup of the procedure itself. And I really want to highlight two particular arenas, so the public participation component, as well as tribal consultation. Both seem to be irrevocably broken in some kind of way. And tribal consultation, of course, is like well beyond pipelines only, and even NEPA only. The relationship between the federal government and tribes and how these are mediated by specific institutions is a much more complex problem than just pipelines themselves. But highlighting that kind of demonstrates how we're not going to get around these problems without kind of taking that into account. So inclusion is understood to be rarely meaningful. Mitigation is uneven or unfair. From one landowner to the next, mitigation, they might receive different kinds of treatment from pipeline firms, as well as from subcontracted construction companies and the like. And then really the overall point is that political disagreement is dissuaded in favor of a consensus approach, and a consensus approach that only appreciates some aspects of intervention into any kind of particularly proposed pipeline. So quickly, why do people think this? You go to events like this evidentiary hearing, and the Public Utilities Commissioner falls asleep during the hearing itself. Not exactly a feeling of respect generated by that. There's a sense that representation of the people, of grassroots citizen groups, is not really felt within public utilities commissions, some of which are elected, but many of which are appointed. And really, we're kind of administrative bodies in a lot of states that didn't interface with the public in this kind of way up until very recently. And then there's also this question, so these are the kinds of documents that I'll look at for things that I can't attend. So, this person is testifying that they feel that the whole regulatory hearing process is illegitimate, as it violates our right to govern ourselves and our communities and to decide for ourselves whether the pipeline is a good fit for our state. And I think that highlights really nicely what I'm talking about when I'm saying, the problem is much bigger than the technical problems themselves, but about who makes the decisions and at what scales and with what consequences. And so what if we take this then as a social problem? It becomes a lot more thorny and a lot more difficult to deal with. And I know that no one likes the presentation that ends with "there are no easy solutions," but really maybe that's something that we need to really sit with and think about. So here, what I think a lot of these folks are kind of trying to say is that political and social values are embedded in our infrastructure systems in a way that sometimes we don't always acknowledge or think about. That the priorities that we make as a society or as at a different scale or community level are in some way connected or bound to the kinds of infrastructure systems that we choose. And we can think about this across infrastructures too. The ways in which roads and power lines and other sorts of systems also evidence certain kind of political values. And so that might mean that contestation of infrastructure systems like pipelines is really evidencing meaningful and perhaps irreconcilable differences in imagining democracy, public health, and future. And that if opponents are really asking this question about what kind of future do we want to leave for our descendants or children, our communities, that question can't be really answered. Like it demands technical responses, of course, but it can't be answered in a solely technical or scientific way. And so, trying to understand and grapple with that question and what it means for people in this region, which I guess I should probably say I'm also from South Dakota, and so I'm studying myself in some kind of way, and my parents, right, is, I think, a really interesting way of thinking about energy geographies at this time. So with that, I'll just say thanks to you all. Thanks again to Jeff for organizing. Feel free to chat with me about this, ask me questions. I've got an email address to promise I won't bite or protest or anything here. So, and I'll leave there. Yeah, perfect. Do you want this, Stacey?
Yeah. Okay,
There you go.
awesome. Let me set my timer as well. Okay, so to follow up on a question that Kai asked, whether or not, whether or not transition, right, is something that requires a technical solution, I would say in part, but in my field, we think about it more in terms of imagination. So not only a technical solution, but also kind of a logical and imaginative problem, right? How do we begin to imagine an alternative to conventional energy systems, conventional infrastructures, right, that in our minds really have no template. Excuse me for 1 second, I'm trying to, you can time me, right? Okay, cool, all right. Anyway, okay, so I'm a little bit of an outlier at this conference. I guess I should say my work is pipeline adjacent. So I'm in a field called the Energy Humanities, which, thank you, Jeff, gave a wonderful introduction. And what we do is think about the relationships between energy and culture, which is to say, think about the ways in which cultural mechanisms like popular novels and films, right, help us to think about energy forms, help us to think about the ways in which our culture is both produced by and dependent upon energy, specifically petroleum, et cetera. Anyway, and so my background is also a little bit strange. I was actually an environmental science undergrad, and 20 years ago, wanting to do both English and environmental science was something that wasn't incredibly popular. I now actually have many Emmas, which is wonderful. So ultimately going on to do a PhD in English with an environmental studies emphasis was something that was kind of unheard of then and is very popular now, which is wonderful. Anyway, and so what I do, I think about energy and culture. I teach courses in post-colonial environments, environmental justice, landscape aesthetics, et cetera. And again, so what I'm going to talk about today are the ways in which we not necessarily, I guess, enable or enact transition through technical means so much as the ways in which we might be able to imagine transition and the ways in which cultural forms, again, help us or hinder us in that regard. So, okay, so probably a familiar image because here we are on the 20th anniversary of the Olympic pipeline explosion in Bellingham. And so on that anniversary, and in a warming world where industry stakeholders increasingly embrace the possibility of alternative energy in the face of pending climate collapse and what people are calling peak oil, et cetera, if also the possibility of lucrative markets and other forms of energy, right? In today's remarks, I'm actually looking to speculative fiction as a means of imagining an alternative energy infrastructure that, for many critics and consumers, actually has no template, which is to say, in the popular imagination, no alternative to fossil fueled systems of political economy has ever existed, right? And so what we're going to do today is attempt to imagine one, or at the very least, we're going to talk about or begin to understand why we can't imagine one. Also, per Kai's remarks, not only do I feel that there is no purely technical solution, I also have no answers. I'm not saying that you don't have answers, but I'm saying I don't. So my answer is to sort of ask us to think about and engage in an imaginative enterprise to begin to sort of think about how we might transition, right? I don't necessarily know that ultimately when I conclude thinking about like local energy catchment, if that's the solution, maybe one of them, we'll see. Anyway, okay, so why can't we imagine transition? Why can't we imagine any form of political economy outside of that which is fueled by petroleum, right, or fossil fuels more broadly? And so I don't know if we've seen this term before. The Anthropocene, probably. Sort of, yeah, okay. So the timing of the era, I mean, both the name itself, which is to say the privileging of anthropos or man as a singular agent, has been problematic in the humanities and social sciences, so too the timing of it. And so we've sort of consistently contested, like, at what moment in our modern history, right, do human beings become geological agents, which is to say agents with the ability to transform planetary systems, right? So does it begin in the proto-capitalist landscape of the long 16th century, which is to say with the rise of transnational plantation economies, right? Or does it begin with James Watt and the patenting of the steam engine, and thus the possibility of having these sort of transatlantic and global coal power factory systems and such. So these are two scenarios. There are lots of other questions. Some people say, well, no, it begins in the Neolithic age, which is to say the beginning of sedentary agriculture, so maybe it was then. Or maybe it begins in what's called the Great Acceleration of the post-war era. Regardless of when we think it began, we always align it with moments in which there were significant spikes in atmospheric carbon. And so for that reason, however we want to date this period, we always date it in terms of carbon and in terms of fossil fuels, which is to say modern capitalism has never aligned with another means of fueling culture. Again, why it's so hard to imagine another way to sort of exist in the world, right? And again, why people like me are thinking, well, maybe we need to start thinking about how to imagine it, right? Or think differently. So anyway, owing to our inability to imagine this, a lot of industry and lay critics think of our present moment as one of energy impasse. So impasse, of course, something that you can't really transcend beyond, right? But we in the energy humanities are starting to think, well, what if we were to think about it instead as a moment of opportunity, right? So instead of it as being a kind of a mobility interregnum, per many critics, maybe it's a moment in which, or a moment we ought to think about in terms of what Imre Zeman and Dominic Boyer and so forth call radical indeterminacy, which is to say a moment per Boyer and Simony Howe that is kind of rich with opportunity. They describe this particular moment not in terms of impasse, but instead they say energy transitions are ambivalent, both anticipatory and unknown, where hope and caution are equally gathered. So, right, you're standing at an impasse, or really we should say a precipice. We don't really know what's beyond it, right? And there's no logical reason to think that the only thing beyond it is Mad Max, right? Which we'll get to in a moment, right? There's no logical reason for that. Indeed, as Jeff said earlier too, this is but a blip, right? So maybe there is something else beyond it. Anyway, so I would also add to this, since this is a very different audience than I'm used to, and there are a lot, people in the industry and stuff, that whether or not, we're thinking of opportunity in terms of financial opportunity or the opportunity to save our species or whatever the case may be, maybe if we think about this in terms of opportunity, we can sort of get out of the kind of trappings of political inertia that seem to set in when we think about this, right? Or I guess economic inertia too. Okay, so I kind of already said this, but I'll just say this again. Why the heck is an English professor talking about energy to a room full of people in the industry? So again, I'm part of this field called the Energy Humanities, and sort of like Energy Humanities 1.0, I guess we'll call it, was really concerned with what Tim Mitchell calls carbon democracies, concerned with the formation of the petrostate, which is to say forms of political economy that are fueled by petroleum-based energy forms and such, and also sort of our inquiries into the role of energy, et cetera, as an index of modern artistic production. So that was kind of Energy Humanities 1.0. 2.0, which is to say, well, what I'm doing now or what I'm doing today, is really more interested in the possibility of a just transition. So not merely transition, but indeed a just transition away from the evident substrate of a global petroculture. So here's yet another term, which I'll define in just a moment. I'm just going to grab a water. Oh, thank you. Okay. My apologies. I have terrible allergies, and it's starting to. So, if on the one hand we're thinking about the possibility of just transition, thank you. Sorry. A correlative question that we're asking is the role of the arts and the humanities in articulating a path forward not dependent upon petroleum, which might enable us to actually catalyze transition and then by extension, hopefully a just transition. we're also interested in historically sanctioned kind of forms of environmental stewardship that aligned with the sorts of which aligned with the sorts of anthropocentric thinking that we discussed in the past slide. So from the ancient pastorals penned by Virgil to the myths of untrammeled wilderness that we see in the works of Henry David Thoreau or Emerson and so forth, we have long imagined the sort of neat distinction between the human and the non-human landscape, which enabled a particular form of environmental stewardship that ultimately allowed us to not only see the country and the city as these two separate spheres, but to live comfortably in the city while imagining the country as this kind of, unimaginable, untrammeled, kind of perfect sacred elsewhere, right? So arguably, if the locomotive were the infrastructural mechanism that could kind of transport Thoreau, right, from the city to the country, today we have other infrastructural means that sort of allow for us to kind of live in one sphere and imagine the other, however imperfectly, and that might be something like a pipeline. Okay, so what is petroculture? Petroculture is defined in many ways. One working definition we might look at is the broad field of cultural representations and symbolic forms that have taken shape around the fugacious material of oil in the 150 years since the inception of the U.S. petroleum industry. Okay, so essentially different cultural representations, not unlike this one, which may or may not be familiar, that represent the sort of impacts of petroleum and or the ways in which we imagine it. So is this a familiar image to people, right? Okay, so from the 1956 Giant, here's James Dean being sort of rained upon with the benevolent rains of black gold, right? A very kind of particular image of the petroleum industry. Now, within the Energy Humanities, the scope of our work has been to think about energy not only in terms of petroleum, but sort of to broaden that and to think about coal and wood, whale oil, et cetera, right? But petroculture broadly conceived looks like this, and this is what we're thinking about. And so when we think about petroculture, again, thinking about sort of cultural productions that kind of lay bare the impacts of the petroleum industry, many of which look rather celebratory, which is certainly the case here, right? Slightly less the case here. So here's the film, There Will Be Blood from 2007, based upon the novel by Upton Sinclair, Oil, exclamation point, written in 1926, which actually chronicles sort of the perils and the trials of the industry, but nonetheless, a very different perspective than we'll see in just a moment. So as we're imagining oil, in the global north and thinking about what we're calling the aesthetics of petroleum, we have the James Dean shot, and even in the face of a more critical examination, we still have the sort of perspective of the prospector, like looking at the derrick, right? So here in the 1850s, in the putative birth of the petroleum industry, which is actually erroneous. We know that it's actually in what was then called Burma in the 1850s. It actually didn't happen here, but anyway, nor was it really kind of established here in any real way. But that said, this is the popular image of the quote beginning of the birth of oil, right? And so here's the prospector looking out. Now, if you move into the global south, petroculture looks very different, right? Not surprisingly. So if the aesthetics of petroleum in the global north, or the ways in which we imagine oil, right, might be the kind of black gold showering James Dean, or it might be the prospector kind of looking kind of lovingly and pridefully upon the derrick, right? In the global south, it looks very different. So in Nigeria, for example, in Ogoni land, which is a native landscape adjacent to Lagos, which was enclosed by Shell Oil Company in 1858. So again, it's a similar moment, right? Essentially, what we see is not necessarily a celebration, but we see a desecration of a landscape and the bemoaning of that desecration by local communities. And so here, and I brought up a poem today, which I'm going to try to talk a little faster, but anyway, so Ken Saro-Wiwa, who is a poet, playwright, and activist, who was actually killed by the Nigerian military regime in 1996. He also is the founder of something called the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, which was largely a movement that was both founded and cultivated in the interest of pushing Shell out of the region. He gives us this very, very different perspective on oil, right? So here we have Ogoni is the land, the people Ogoni, the agony of trees dying in ancestral farmlands, streams polluted, weeping, filth into murky rivers. It is the poisoned air coursing the luckless lungs of dying children. Agony is the dream breaking the looping chain around the drooping neck of a shell-shocked land. And shell-shocked, of course, is now a double entendre. Okay, so very different perspective, right? Probably a silly question, but these are the kinds of questions I talk to my students about, right? Kind of what accounts for the difference of perspective, right, between giant and Sarawiwa. Obviously, where we're standing, right, and the beneficiary of the industry. But a more important question for energy humanists and for what I do in the classroom as well is the ways in which these aesthetic works sort of help to form and or cultivate the ways in which we imagine and think about energy. So to what extent are these sorts of cultural forms, probably the more recognizable ones like giant and oil, right? To what extent are those responsible for the ways in which we interact with and think about and imagine energy, and then by extension, maybe energy transition? And another question that we're thinking about now, and this is what I'm going to get into, is like, are there any other images or narratives that are available to us as critics and consumers to imagine energy otherwise? So are the only kind of images and narratives available to us either the sort of petro-utopia, in which we have benevolent black gold and whatnot, or the petro-apocalypse, in which we have the destruction of land? And furthermore, the petro-apocalypse that we'll talk about in a second that we see in films like Mad Max and a number of other things, right? Are there other narratives that are available to us? But this forces us to ask another question, which is to say how we frame the unimaginable. So what I was saying earlier, we can't really imagine anything outside of the kind of petrostate or the petro system, right? Because we've never experienced that, right? And so all we can really imagine at peak oil is this kind of apocalypse, right? But again, that seems really problematic, really politically and financially, I guess, unuseful, right? And so how do we frame the unimaginable? How do we think beyond kind of energy apocalypse? How do we think beyond the dominant narratives of the utopian and the dystopian related to this, right? And so per the After Oil Collective, which is a really wonderful collective of scholars working in the energy humanities, asking these sorts of questions, they put this question as such, right? Is there a useful utopian counter-narrative to the dystopic or catastrophic one? So, which is to say, instead of thinking about kind of petro-utopia vis-a-vis James Dean, is there another kind of utopian narrative that we can think about at peak oil or beyond impasse or whatnot? Okay, and so another question I would pose here, and I'm taking a term from Dominic Boyer, is there a narrative beyond that which is framed by conventional expressions of energo power? So I'm sorry for all the neologisms today, so we do interfere a lot. And so energo power, Boyer defines as the political power derived from electricity or fuel and the narratives that champion its extraction. Such narratives, of course, include both political ideology and also aesthetic expression. So an expression of energo power might be something like what we're seeing in Giant, right? But so too the sorts of political ideologies that are embedded in those images, right? And that are then expressed politically also through both the exportation of such images and also through foreign policy, right, and different relationships. Anyway, so as a literary critic interested in the virtue of imagination, I am going to adopt this and think about energo poetics. So not merely the ways in which energy is articulated in sort of particular forms of power, but also the ways in which energy is articulated in what we're calling kind of carbon cultures, or articulated in different kind of aesthetic movements. Are we okay? Okay, yeah, okay. I'm going to move a little bit faster. Okay. So maybe I'll just say very quickly, this might. So to read literature in the way that we do, which again might be very new to people in this room, I'm not sure. But as energy humanists, we try to get away from things like the medieval period or the romantic period or even the post-colonial period. The latter, as we know in my field, a fairly apocryphal term, right? It's a really problematic periodization, et cetera. And so we've been trying to think about works of literature in terms of the ages of wood or oil or wind, right? So how do we read Moby Dick, for example, as a novel about sort of either the age of wind or the age of whale oil, right? Rather than thinking about it in terms of a sort of 19th century American text, et cetera, right? So how do we sort of think in those terms? And so it's that sort of thinking that motivates the ways in which I'm going to read two texts today. And so what we're going to do is kind of think about, again, how we kind of articulate narratives that either reinforce petrodystopia and or how we imagine kind of a world beyond that dystopia and what sorts of narratives articulate that. And so if on the one hand, so I'm going to look at a novel called Shipbreaker by Paolo Bacigalupi, which I don't know if people know, which is also about the end of oil. And it's very much in keeping with like the Mad Max series, The Walking Dead. I'm sure those are familiar, right? Okay. I should say too, I mean, I think that the funniest thing about The Walking Dead, and as somebody, I was environmental science undergrad, I was also an environmental activist and an alternative energy activist for many, many years and a lifelong bike commuter. So when it took 4 seasons for them to discover a bicycle, my friends and I were all laughing out loud. You know, it's like, gosh, you know, like we're so incapable of imagining any alternative to this particular culture, right? That in this really popular television program was like, yeah. So I'm sorry, 4 seasons, not 4 episodes. Anyway, and so obviously we're having a pretty hard time imagining beyond that. I'll argue today that works of speculative fiction that tend toward the dystopian, like Shipbreaker, are, I think, very problematic insofar as they reinforce that narrative. On the other hand, works of speculative ethnography, such as we see in Dominic Boyer and Simoni's Howe's work, which is to say Wind and Power in the Anthropocene, which is a really wonderful speculative project. These are projects that ask us to sort of speculate on the possibility of something else, to imagine otherwise, if you will. And so, but first, dystopia. Okay, so what I'm going to kind of do is like go through some dystopian images and the ways in which they're problematic, and then move on to Boyer and Howe and think about whether or not those offer us not necessarily solutions, but perhaps a template for imagining alternatives or whatnot. Okay, so is this familiar? Yeah, all right. Okay, so here's the new Mad Max. Once again, you know, we have like sort of the American 70s muscle car broken down. He's looking for gas, you know, whatever. Anyway, so this is a work in the speculative mode. This is a work of speculative fiction. And so speculative fiction is a broad category inclusive of science fiction. I'm only going through some of these. I want to go through these definitions too, because I realize we're not all in the same field. And so anyway, it refers to texts that imagine possible realities beyond the scope of the conventionally realist. So speculative texts tend to imagine. They also project, whether spatially or temporally, different futures, different realities, if you will. And sort of these temporal projections, or the sort of projection into a different future, right, is a stock convention of sci-fi. It's also a stock convention of cli-fi, which is a fairly new genre, or climate fiction, which is to say science fiction that accounts of kind of climate collapse, essentially. Very little cli-fi really does anything more than kind of speculate on or project, total disaster, right? And so in the above image, of course, we have this, horrible desert scape. The future's bleak. He's looking for Gastown, whatever. And I won't spoil it, but you probably know he's not going to find it. Anyway, so, and then we have other really problematic images, like this one, right? So if you really want to kind of instill fear and have people, beset with political inertia and terror, offer them images of Los Angeles under siege by a series of completely absurd and scientifically impossible tornadoes, and which apparently will happen overnight. So in these sorts of projections, we have the end of the world is nigh, and you have 24 hours before all Earth systems collapse completely and we all die, right? And so, inarguably, you're leaving the theater realizing there's really just put your head in the sand. We're done, right? And so we can see why these sorts of images are problematic. Now, this is also the case in dystopian climate fiction, in dystopian prose fiction. So Paolo Bacigalupi's 2010 Shipbreaker, which is a wonderful novel, it's also a novel that anticipates the end of oil, kind of Mad Max scenario. In this one, he dramatizes a salvage economy that occurs, quote, after oil. It's set in the southeastern United States, right here. So I thought it'd be kind of interesting as an example. And in it, essentially, his protagonists are scrapping tankers, trying to get parts and whatever, and just trying to find fuel. And it's a fairly conventional, it's kind of Mad Maxy. So I just sort of give you a couple of, maybe just one quote from this, and we'll sort of move forward. So essentially the reader is sort of witnessing the kind of bloody end of oil. And the novel is just the surfeit of catastrophic images, and blood and guts is kind of amazing. And so it opens up with Naylor, one of the protagonists, literally drowning in oil. The tanker was huge, one of those workhorses of the oil age, almost a floating city in itself. And now he was deep in its guts. He hit liquid, warm, and viscous. Blackness swallowed him with barely a ripple. He began hauling himself back up out of the muck. His lungs screamed for air. Hand over hand, he dragged himself higher. He fought the urge to breathe, to give up and fill his lungs with oil. Yeah, just kind of horrifying, right? He's like literally drowning in it. And I mean, the irony too is that the entire novel is I'm sort of like looking for scraps of oil and other things, right? And then this is kind of what, So I may not go through all of these different passages, but just to say too, the novel is also sort of rife with all of these other kind of images of apocalypse. We hear about failed infrastructural projects, apparently all sorts of high-speed trains and all these things that had fallen apart, and lots of things that we actually have imagined. So Bacigalupi effectively shows how, the ways in which they all kind of disintegrated. Some right here in Pontchartrain Bay, and so forth. And so I can share these passages later in the interest of, time. But essentially what he does is kind of really trap us in a kind of imaginative stasis, right? And so the argument against cli-fi and these sorts of images is that if in the sort of energy imagination or in the political imagination, we're facing a kind of energy impasse, within the humanities, what cli-fi is effectively doing is reinforcing that same thing and posing what we might think of as a kind of aesthetic impasse, right? We cannot think beyond any of this. And so this is why, rather than look to that, I'm interested in speculative fictions that might ask us or allow for us to engage a kind of different logic and to kind of think differently about these systems, right? And so there's a really wonderful new co-authored book by, again, Dominic Boyer and Simone Howe, in which they do, in fact, attempt to imagine a different scenario. And they refer to it as utopian, but utopian in the way that the After Oil Collective is asking us to be, right? So utopian in the sense that it will have to make a world that has not yet existed, and revolutionary in the sense that it will not be accompanied by technology or markets or violence or anthropocentrism or any of the other behaviors or attitudes that brought us here in the first place. So again, we can only imagine otherwise if that future is delimited by a very different kind of set of realities, right? And these, according to Howe and Boyer, may seem impossible, but they're surely the futures that are worth having, right? Okay, and so essentially, yeah, okay, we're good, okay. So essentially what they do, they're thinking about alternative energy. So they're not thinking about petroleum, they're not thinking about kind of fossil-fueled systems of political economy. They go to Mexico to look at the viability of wind economies. And so what the project does is document a series of actually failed wind parks, unfortunately, but document wind energy in Mexico, specifically in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec there, which has the largest per capita wind power in the world, and has been very, very successful very locally in terms of supplying wind to local grids. But ultimately, it's also been very unsuccessful politically because of the ways in which it's impacted those communities. And so I think, as we saw in Kai's work, there's a way in which wind power in Mexico is sort of committing the same sorts of crimes as some of the fossil fuel industries there. And so for that reason, so they concentrate on wind power. They walk us through the kind of history of Mexican independence. And think about the ways in which Mexico is kind of the premier petrostate. So following independence in the 30s, petrol is nationalized into Pemex, and that's effectively kind of the sort of the center of their economy for many years, and only recently has wind begun to sort of move in on that. But anyway, so they track all of these different wind parks, but ultimately realize that, gosh, renewable energy matters, but it matters more how it is brought into being and what forms of consultation and cooperation are used. Which is to say, if we're going to imagine otherwise, we can't simply think about a movement from petrol to wind or solar or hydro, or whatever the case may be, as a panacea, right? That shift has to be accompanied by a robust kind of shift in thinking, by a substantial shift in political economy and all of those things. And so ultimately, the project kind of meditates on these questions about unjust transition. And I don't think we have time today, but I mean, there's so many examples of this. So, I mean, the native communities in Mexico are essentially smashing wind turbines there because of the ways in which they're enclosing native land, in the same way that Indian farmers in Rajasthan have been smashing photovoltaic panels. Also, by the way, wind turbines and PV panels are made out of rare metals that are mined, so there are so many contradictions here that are hugely problematic. And so they kind of walk us through that, and ultimately, the conclusion is that we really need to sort of engage in a different thinking or a different kind of logic to begin to imagine something beyond, again, petrodystopia, or maybe what they would call aeolian, which is to say wind utopia. And so, because again, as we see here, I'll kind of move more quickly, Mexico offers a concise praxis for both thinking about the rise of the petrostate and also thinking about the ways in which transition can be unjust. And this is why I think Boyer and Howe ultimately, again, ask us to think about, okay, gosh, it's not just about wind, it's about something else. How do we kind of change our thinking? And so I'll just say a couple of things about Howe's part of the project, and then maybe conclude, and we can have some time for questions, yeah. And so in Boyer's part, it's called Energopolitics, and he walks us through the framework of energo power and all of the ways in which transition cannot work because of conventional structures of power. Howe does something totally different. Howe instead engages in the speculative. She begins her ecologics, which is her part of it, in the same way that Rachel Carson began Silent Spring. So if you remember the beginning of Silent Spring, it begins with a fable for tomorrow. Essentially, Howe begins with a fable of wind. And then the entire book is kind of in the subjunctive, the what if. And so what she does, sort of, what if we were to engage wind in this other way? What if we were to think about the human and non-human landscapes that were impacted by different systems of power? What if we were to stop thinking about kind of, this inability to sort of move beyond this and instead concentrate on the ways in which we might move beyond it, right? And so indeed she offers us, I think, a template for actually cultivating a useful utopian narrative. There aren't necessarily any answers because it ultimately ends by saying we just need to come up with a different kind of politics and what she calls ecologic. But there's no real template for doing that, right? And so again, we're at a kind of impasse. There are some practical suggestions, like we see throughout that some of the wind parks kind of succeed temporarily because of reliance on local catchment and such. But ultimately the Mexican government's like, no, we need a central grid, local catchment's not gonna work. I won't bore you with all those details. But ultimately there aren't a lot of answers. But the real kind of virtue of the work is this sort of the subjunctive, is the what if. And so kind of employing the what if here, so what if we were to think differently, right, about energy forms, and systems of political economy, and the possibility of thinking beyond Mad Max, right? Like, could we in fact, and I mean, this is in California last summer, I'm driving through and thinking like, why don't we do this, right? Could we in fact have systems of local catchment in like California or Kansas, for example? Are there other means of sort of existing that don't in fact depend upon the removal of native communities, that don't in fact depend upon an economic and political philosophy that privileges anthropos or man above all other things, right? Is that possible? And so I kind of end with, I don't know. But in the energy humanities, at least, our work is to sort of think about that possibility and to think about the ways in which imagination works. And so I'll just end with this. So Boyer and Howe's answer to the apocalyptic scenarios plaguing our imaginations is to engage in a different mode of thinking altogether. So they ask us to imagine energy as a life force and not merely a commodity, land as a source of common good, and energy systems as communally operated. And so the task, I think, for us, whether industry stakeholders or academicians, is to somehow transmit that sort of thinking to energy consumers, right? And arguably we do that, I think, most impactfully through popular cultural forms, right? More people are going to see the new Mad Max, right, than going to, than reading new legislation or whatnot. And so anyway, so I guess I sort of end with, obviously we're not going to get there through images of apocalypse like Mad Max, so is there another way of kind of articulating this? And I think I'm going to end there. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. I know lunch is beckoning.
Yes.
But we have
sorry.
we have a few minutes though to take questions if you'd like to ask questions to any of us, Kai and Stacey in particular. Oh, can you? I'll, for the webcast.
Do you think there's maybe not more imagination around this like future utopia because the actual process of getting there is actually just a bunch of really boring regulatory proceedings?
I mean, it could very well be, but if the answer is a bunch of really boring regulatory proceedings, then that also presumes that we sort of can't imagine a political economy outside of that. Does that make sense? So maybe it isn't just a bunch of those proceedings, right? Maybe it's engaging in a different sort of politics altogether. Does that make sense? Which would also be why we can't imagine it, right? Because the idea that would force us to imagine a different politics that wasn't dependent on such proceedings or like sort of existing modes of regulation.
Yes, Simona, go ahead. Oh.
First of all, thank you so much, Jeff, for making this happen. I believe that this is really important. I'm an anthropologist myself, so, but I'm not practicing an anthropology life. I'm practicing working on pipeline safety. And the reason why is because, all you're talking about is actually happening in some ways, I believe. And I think that it'd be really useful to somehow integrate these conversations into our future conversations about pipeline safety and even integrity management. All that boring stuff is actually about the culture of pipelines, safety, and energy. And so, I think there just needs to be more of a marrying of all of those conversations. And you'll hear later on, I know, we're going to talk more about the issue of culture, and those of us who participated from the public perspective, with industry and with regulators in trying to imagine a different future. We are actually maybe a little bit positive or optimistic that there is a way forward because there is enough interest by those within the industry to imagine a different future. But maybe for their own self-interest, and we all have our own self-interest, but also for the greater good. I believe. And I think a lot of this has to do with understanding the power dynamics and what those mean to those looking from the outside in to how we're going to get to a different future, but also from those of us working inside and understanding how we relate to one another. So the piece that is missing, and I would just argue, is that we really need to understand the interpersonal pieces a little bit more. And it's great to, I love what you're talking about, obviously. That's my bailiwick. But I really believe all of this comes down to relationships that are being built and imagination that we're creating together. And the Pipeline Safety Trust has done a great job of bringing us all together to do this. So that's one of the good things. And I also I have to add, this is way overdue because entropy is something we can never escape. And so we have to understand transitions. That's what we need to all be thinking about. So thank you for being brave enough to come here and do this.
Either of you want to respond? We can take 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, first, I'd actually like to maybe say I wish one of your Emmas will write a book, about and imagine a different future, because I certainly don't want to read any more dystopian books about the end of humanity. And one question for you, Kai. Do you actually think that pipeline opposition now actually is being used as proxy to address a lot of social and political issues? And if that's the case, really, how does industry or even how do regulators can respond to it? Because to me, it just seems a little bit too chaotic to actually find any solution if we actually cannot even state what the problem is.
Yeah, so do we need to be speaking to the microphone too? Or is there... Okay, thanks. Yeah, so thanks for that question. And so it's difficult because I do think that both on the one hand, as a prior comment sort of indicated, is that there are kind of processes that are being worked out towards more functioning systems, right, more than they currently are, which is better. But I do think that really at the heart of a lot of the opposition at least in this region, and it varies by, where you are, of course, the heart of it is really about more kind of difficult questions than simply being specific to pipelines. And so I don't know if proxy is necessarily the word, but I do think that a lot of what is being expressed, the kinds of resentments that people feel, aren't necessarily pipeline specific. They're resentments about feeling left behind, in this country, about feeling like, rural places aren't treated as if they matter. And a lot of folks aren't doing, in South Dakota, for example, aren't doing super well economically. And so those kinds of problems are bigger questions than pipeline-specific battles, but they're expressed in these battles because there's nowhere else to do it. And these become the instances where it's the last straw sort of situation where it kind of the tinder is lit or whatever. So from the perspective of industry and regulators and others, I think that coming into these situations with that understanding can maybe help realize it's not all, even though they're obviously demonized in some kind of way, it's not all your fault per se, because people are really expressing a broader dissatisfaction that might not necessarily be specific.
You want to say quick? Go ahead.
Everyone's going to say no.
We gotta wait.
I just want to pause and not give too much of an out in the industry side, because there's definitely an imbalance of power that happens in these situations. And so I don't want to be too forgiving in that case.
I think this is a great thing to talk about over lunch.
One of the great things about the Pipeline Safety Trust Conference is that there's lots of opportunity for commiseration outside of panels. So enjoy lunch. Let the conversation continue. Thank you.
So it's being served downstairs in the Royal Room. There's somebody at the bottom of the stairs to
Thanks
point you to the
to
right
Kai
hallway.
and
Handled like an executive.
right, I know, right? Yeah, right.